In today's tutorial, we are going to be having a look at a super sick text animation. It's an effect I love to do a lot, but it is pretty time consuming, so you can't do it for everything. But you've probably seen something like it in a lot of logo animations or cool teaser pieces. But without further ado, let's hop straight into After Effects, where I have a 1920 by 1080 composition set up, 24 frames per second to keep it nice and simple. I've added a text layer and just typed out hello friend. I'm using the Satoshi font. First thing we're going to do is take our text, and you want to right click on it and then create shapes from text. As you can see, this keeps our text layer intact, but we're going to delete it because it's not going to be of much use to us later. This is also why it makes it so hard to do it for if you have a lot of titles and want to do this effect. It takes a lot of time. Essentially what it does is it creates one single shape layer where it has every single letter inside of it as a separate shape. You can do this manually by duplicating the shape layer for however many letters you have and then deleting every single one except for the one you want to keep. So for this case, you want one layer for the H, one layer for the E, one for the L. Or you can be efficient and download the Motion Tools plugin, which is free, which I highly recommend. And they have an extract feature, so if you select your shape layer and hit extract, it'll put every single shape inside of that shape layer into its own layer, which makes it a lot easier to work with. And now we can start animating it pretty much. We're going to be using a couple of different parameters to animate it. We're going to be using the path, we're going to be using scale, position, and rotation. So most of the parameters you can play with, we're going to be playing with. It's always a good idea to have somewhat of a thought of how you're going to attack this in terms of movements and different ideas for letters. Like some letters just work better for one thing. I've drawn out a little sketch of what I thought we could do, so that's exactly what we're going to do. And we're going to start with the H. I'm just going to hide everything but the H to start with because I don't want to be too confused with everything else that's going on. We can always sync up the animation later on, but for now we'll start with one letter at a time. I will open up my H, go into contents and open it up until I get the path, which is what I want to animate to begin with. I'm going to go forward to about 1 second and keyframe it so we have the shape itself in the position that we want it to be, which is just going to make it easier later down the line than trying to fiddle it back to get to where we want it to be. And now we can go back a little bit, and my idea here is to stretch the H a little bit and get some nice shapes in there. So I'm just going to zoom in a little bit, and I still just have my select tool, and we can start selecting some points and points that we don't want. I'm going to start out by bolding up these legs and maybe even drag it out a little bit more. And I might even click on the path to select all of them, go back a little bit more, and then move it over, and we will hit the path again, and I will just skinny up this first set of legs to about what it was to begin with and drag this to be further out. So now we have an animation that looks kind of like this, where it pushes in and it does a little bit of drag. And that is pretty much it for the H. So now we can hop on to the next thing. Now I'm going to do the E, the two L's, and the O all at the same time because I want them to play together with the motion. I want to make it a one cohesive piece. To start with, I am going to duplicate my O, and I want to have the E start out as an O and then get into its shape. So I'm going to use that because they are pretty much the same, they're pretty much the same thing, like the same shape, so that makes it a little bit easier for us. Some fonts, that's different, so you have to be mindful of what fonts that you are playing with. But essentially, that's what we're going to do, and I'm going to select the E and the O and change the color of them so we know that they are together instead of just having everything blue. And that's just going to help us keep it organized a little bit. Now, I want to take our second O and our actual O and hit P to bring up the position for them. Let's just go forward to about 2 seconds and keyframe that. And then I want to go back and I want to essentially have them come in from the same shape. And so I'm going to drag this in and I want to line it up roughly in the middle of the two L's. And we'll take that second O and line it up with that as well. So now we have these that come apart, and I will trim this first O, our fake O, to start right here, because before that we don't need both shapes. I want to open up the path for our second O because we'll animate that a little bit as well to get some nice stretching in there. We are going to move back a little bit, and we have two paths for the O. We have the inside and we have the outside, so we'll keyframe both of those, and then we'll go back a little bit and kind of take these and stretch them down to get a little bit of that squash and stretch effect. And we don't have to be super perfect, we just want to get the feel of the stretching. So we have that coming back up, and then we of course need it to be the same as it was before, so you can just copy the last keyframes and paste them in. So now we have this little stretch. The only thing that we're missing now is the bounce down, because we want it to drop down and then have that little squash, and then separate. So again, we'll be using the position for this one, and we will add a position keyframe to be in its spot right where it is squashed. Go back a little bit and drag it upwards so that we have it coming down and getting squashed, and we ideally want the squash to happen pretty quick. Maybe draw that in a little bit closer so that it lands and stretches. Drag the position keyframes a little bit before so it comes down, squashes, and goes back. We can maybe drag this up a little bit more to get a little bit more momentum in there for this squash. You can already get an idea of how this will feel. We haven't added any easing to the keyframes, but that'll help sell the effect a lot because we can convey movement and weight and all that good stuff. Next up is adding a little bit of scale, and in this case I am going to unlink the scale to this, and as it's dropping in I want it to skinny up. That is another part of the squash and stretch. We can keyframe the scale to be at about 100% right there. As it's starting to come down, we want it to be at 100, and then as it's free falling, we want it to be a little bit skinnier. Play around with the timing of it a little bit so that it's squashed. So now we get some of that squash, and then as it lands, it stretches out and comes back to its normal shape. Now we can hit U to hide everything but our keyframes, and if we play that back, we have this nice little animation. Now the only thing I want to add to this little bit is a little bit of motion of our fake O to sell the transition of the E, and in this case I'm actually going to use the H as a little barrier, so I'm going to show that. I'm going to go forward a little bit from this last keyframe, and I want to take my fake O and bounce it into the H like this, and then I want to move forward a little bit and copy that keyframe in its actual position. I want to do the same thing with the E, so hit P to bring that up, keyframe its position at its correct spot, and then move forward, and then you want to add that in there to hit the H, and you want to try and line it up pretty good, and then move back forward and copy that. And if you want to take this to the next level, you can add a slight bit of rotation, so hold shift while select your two layers and then shift R to bring up the rotation. You can keyframe the rotation on both of them and then go forward to where it hits and maybe just tilt it ever so slightly so it looks like it's rolling, and then you can take it back, put both of that to 0 just like that. So now we have this little boom. And then we want to cut between the letters right as the action goes on. So as it hits, I want it to turn into the E. So with my fake O, I'm going to hit Shift, Command, and D to split the layer. That's just easier than dragging it all out. And then with the E, I'm just going to hold Shift as I'm dragging this to line it up with that. So now we have this little transition here, which uses that as the little transition point, that little bit of movement. I'm going to hit U twice to remove all my keyframes or like unhide them. And now we can start playing with the L's. I think we'll do a very simple trick for this. We'll select both our layers holding shift and then hit P to bring up the position. We want to end it right here. So hit keyframe the position, maybe move it forward just 1 or 2 frames, and then move back a little bit to right about here. And then we want to line them up right in the middle of this. So if you hit all, you can bring up your rulers, and then I'm just going to line it up, my little guide right in between, and then we can line these up to be right in the middle of this, just like that. So now we have them separating with the O's, just like that. The last thing to do is cut the 1L, doesn't matter which one, to start right there. And then for the second one, again, we will animate the path a little bit to have it kind of shoot up. And we will open the contents, go to L, and keyframe the path, maybe move forward a little bit and go back some, and then select the 2 upper points and drag them down to meet the bottom. So now we have this L that shoots up and then it separates. And if we overlap these keyframes ever so slightly, we just get a little bit of extra pizzazz in there. And that is pretty much it for the first word, which is hello. We can move this by just dragging it out. And just like that, we have a little layer. We of course want to cut this to start right at where it starts moving. Now we can start with our second word, which is friend. I'm just going to hide all of that, and we'll start with the F, and I want it to have a similar feel to the H. So again, we will be opening up the path and keyframe the path, and then just move it forward a little bit, give us some time to work with, and then go back and we will stretch this out a good bit, maybe something like this, and move back a little bit more, and take this whole thing and stretch it out a little bit, and maybe even fatten this up and maybe shorten that up a tiny bit and move it out a little bit more. Boom. So we have kind of like a 2-step animation. The R, I want to play off of that movement. So if I take my R and just hit P, I of course want to show that layer so we can see it. As it's being covered right here, I want to use that to drive my animation, but in the opposite direction. So I'm going to go forward until the F is completely done, and then I want to keyframe the position and go back a little bit and drag it to the left. And now we'll have an animation where it comes out as that comes in, just as a little play off that, and we can trim this layer but we will do that later on once we've decided where everything will go time-wise. Now, the next letter we want to animate is the N, and I will hide the R and F and also show the I, because we will be playing with these together. So we're going to start with the N and hit P to bring up the position, and let's just move forward a little bit, keyframe that, move that keyframe forward a little bit, and then go down, and then we want to take it back up a little bit further than what it came from, so we have it coming down and coming back up, and maybe even down a little bit further than that. And I want to drag this to be closer to the out, so we get this boom, boom. And that right here, we want the ball to come in and then bounce off and then shoot off. Now, luckily for us, the eye is already split into 2 separate shapes, so we can just animate those using the path, which is plenty good. And we have the eye dot here, so we might even want to rename that to eye dot, so we know exactly what is what. And then we have the eye leg, I suppose. We can animate those separately. Now we want to start with the eye and just keyframe all of it, so we know exactly where it's going to be in the end. And now we can start driving that animation. We want to go back to right about here where we want the little ball of the eye to hit our end. So I'm going to zoom in so we can see it a little bit better. I'm going to hit the path of it, and I'll just move it right over here to land right on our end, so that now we get this little ball that flies back to its spot. And then we of course want to drop it from on top, so going back a little bit, click the eye dot path and move it up above, so now it'll fall down and then bounce up. Once it's landed, we want to make it drop down on the eye all the way down and have that path shoot back up. So now we'll take this and we'll drag it all the way down to where the eye begins, and then back up. Now we have the eye coming in, boom, and falling down and back up. We can even take this keyframe, which is our actual end position, and paste it here just to make sure that it is in its exact position that we want it to be. Now we just want to match the path animation for our base to match with this little bounce up, and that'll be pretty simple. We'll just go to the beginning, or to the end, sorry, and move that keyframe over there, and go back and take these and mash them down, so that now we have this little shooting up, kind of like it shoots up. And we can even take this lost keyframe and move it a little bit closer, so that it looks like it's kind of pushing it up, just to give it a little bit more visual interest by layering our sequenced animations. Next up is the D. So I'm going to hide all my keyframes again, and we can go and play with the D. So I'm going to show that, and we're going to be doing a pretty fun animation with this. I've done this once before in an animation, and that is using the belly of the letter to get a little bit of fun movement. I just thought it was a pretty funny idea, and it's pretty simple. We're going to want to start by hitting Y to bring up our anchor point tool actually, and we want to link it down to the bottom right corner so that we can use that as a pivot point for when it springs up. Now from there, it's pretty simple. We want to start by hitting R to bring up the rotation, and then we want to keyframe it in its last position, and then we want to go backwards a little bit, and we want to lay the belly of, or like the back of the D flat. And you could even use a ruler if you want to make sure that it's completely flat, but it should be 90 degrees, should work depending on your font. Now we need to animate the path of the belly to match with that. So if you go to the very end of the D animation, open up the contents and go into the path. Again, we have a cutout and the belly itself, so you want to keyframe both of those. And then you want to go to where it's flat, and then you want to flatten it out. And this is just simple, taking your path and just making it as flat as you possibly can, kind of like it's been in the gym and done a lot of ab work. That is pretty good. And then we can take the second bit, which is the outer bit, and we will drag that in. And just like that, we have our flat D. So if you play it back, you can see it kind of uses that as a little bit of a launch point almost. And to sell this even more, we can even take it a little bit further than 90 degrees, which will just give it a little bit of overshooting, so it kind of bounces up like that. And I also think that if we have a look at it, it looks like it's very flat, so I want to droop it down a little bit more, the belly that is. So if I go into the beginning of where all my path keyframes are, I just maybe want to move them a little bit downwards. Now we have one thing left to do, and that is animating the E. Now I'm going to show all my layers real quick so we can get some sense in here, because as of right now we have this hello and we have the friend, but we don't have the E. And what I thought for the E was to have the friend part missing the E be closer together, and then pop the E up using a simple scale animation, but then have the letters moving outwards and making space for it. It's going to require a little bit of tinkering, but it should be fairly doable. You are going to take the D and E, and you are going to create a new null. So you can go into layer, new null, or use a void, which is a free plugin that you can use. It's essentially the same thing, but without the mess of a solids folder. And then you want to take those 3 layers and change the color of them, maybe to a green, and then just name this ND controller, and then we want to take the F, R, and I and do the same exact thing and just pick a different color for them, maybe fuchsia, and change it to FRI controller. So now if I hit P on both of my controllers, I can move these independently. That's the easiest way of doing this animation without messing with the keyframes of individual letters, because that can be a bit messy because we already have those animated. So on my E, I'm gonna hit S to bring up the scale, and I'm just gonna keyframe it at 100% and then go back a little bit and set it to 0. And now we get a nice little scale up animation. And we wanna keyframe the position of our controller as well. We want to keyframe the X position at the end, and when we move it to the end, I'm actually just gonna take a ruler and put it right in the middle so we know kind of where our two controllers need to meet. And then we're just gonna move them in, scoot them in close, something like that looks pretty good. Now we'll have an animation where the E kind of pushes them out a little bit. And I just think that looks pretty cool. Thought it was a fun little idea. Now that's pretty much it for all the keyframing that we need to do. Now it's time to actually start easing it, which is where you really bring it to life. The first step is lining up our keyframes in the way that we have it. And as you can see, we have a lot of keyframes. So I'm just gonna drag this up so we can see it all and just have a little bit of a preview up here. And we want the H to be the first thing to come in. Take these keyframes, move them forward a little bit. And then as soon as it's just about right here, we want all of this to come in. So we'll drag that up a little bit to be about right here. So take that, and we wanna maybe even scoot it forward just a little bit more because we don't want it to be blocked by the H itself. I want to tighten up the separation a little bit because it can come in a little bit sooner. So just taking this and all of these and moving forward a little bit, and taking this O and just lining up these two keyframes with that. Comes in, squashes out, moves, and bounces out. So that is pretty good. So now we have the first word lined up. So we have hello coming out here, and we want to line up the friend so it starts at just about the same time. So take these keyframes and move them up a little bit to right about here. And I want to cut this layer, or the F, and the same with the H to start right as the first keyframe is coming in, so we don't get a moment of still stand kind of in between them. I want to move this maybe forward a little bit so they don't come in at the same exact time. I want to offset it just a little bit and get the timing a little bit different just to lay out our visual animations and all that good stuff. And then we have this F, and we of course need our R to come in as it moves in. So we have that counter movement right there, maybe even move those up a little bit. The I and the N, we want to make sure that they are linked up. So I'm just going to take them and move them up close here. You can have this start pretty soon, maybe right about here. Take both of these layers and we can delete the stuff that we don't need from them. Take them and maybe right there. So we have that coming in and that. And one thing I can see that we forgot is to line up. Now, one thing we forgot to do is that since we tighten all of these up, our N and I animation got messed up a little bit because of the way that the pulse work and all that stuff. So we're gonna have to change that real quick, which is not a big deal at all. But it's definitely something we would like to catch. So we have that coming in, boom. And again, we'll start right at the end, which is right here. Delete those two keyframes and then move back a little bit to where that impacts right about here, and then just take the path and dunk it down so we have it going up there, and boom. And of course drop him from up high like such, and cut the layer to start right at that keyframe and zoom back out. You can remove that guide and drag this back up. Hit U twice to bring up all the keyframes. We have the E and all of these, we can move those up to be a lot closer. And then we have our D, which can come in. So we have that coming up, and the N kind of boom, boom. And we want to trim this layer, of course, and the same with the R. I want to trim that also. I'm going to take all these keyframes and I'm going to hold F9 or Fn and hit F9. And already just like that, it's just added a little bit more niceness to our animation. All that's left to do is go in and tweak every single one so that it actually looks pretty sick. Hit U to hide all of that, and then I'll just take it one letter at a time. I'm gonna hit U and then click the keyframes, and then use my little graph editor over here to mess with the easing of the keyframes. So right now it's pretty whatever, and I'm actually just gonna solo that, and I'm gonna take this first one and kind of line it up a little bit, and I want it to come in a little bit slower. So I'm gonna drag that in, which is just gonna slow it and then impact kind of like that way. And we might even want to take this in a little bit too, so it's kind of like two pointy pyramids. which is just gonna make the motion a little bit smoother, especially with it lifted off the ground. An important thing to mention here is movements that go together, we wanna move the graph of them at the same time to make sure that the easing is the same on both ends, so we don't have one end that's quicker than the other end, which will just look a little bit wonky. So right here, we can select all of these two first ones, same with this one, and go into our graph editor. And it's going to make it that we have both of them selected at the same time. So now we can speed that up a little bit. Separates out like that, which is pretty cool. Good little bit of impact. And we have this initial squash, and we want it to come in and land with some impact. So we will start it off slower, then move the pace up a little bit. So if you start it off pretty slow, boom, and then it kind of lands, gets a little bit of that impact. Make sure you have the rotation for both of these selected, and even the position as well, just so we get it all at the same exact time. We want to make sure that it is lined up pretty good. As you can see here, we'll take these and we'll move them that way, and then maybe we will take these and also move them that way, so that we have a little bit of just a little bit more impact and keep them nice and moving. I still think this is just a little bit too fast, so I'm just going to keep continuing playing around with these keyframes until I get something that doesn't feel too quick, kind of like this. This is pretty good. A little dink, a little nudge. Now we have the infamous eye and the N animation. I'm going to start with the ball, which is the most important bit, as well as the N. And we want to make sure that it just gets a little bit of a curve as it goes up here, so it doesn't go like just straight up. So we might even take a little bit of an extra keyframe here and just move it up a little bit more so that it goes up and then kind of lands in, and maybe even a little bit more like that. So it kind of goes, boom, and lands back down. And then we can delete this keyframe right in between so that it lands and then jumps up and goes down. We want to make sure that it just goes over just a little bit more before that. So what we want to do in this case is take this specific one and we want to drag it up to be kind of like that, which will help it from going straight into like a weird movement, which should keep the movement flowing a little bit. Move that up and then place that down. That's a little bit better. And then we of course want it to start out slow and land with some impact, so it kind of doinks, and then we want it to be quick to get back up, so move it that way. Then we want it to shoot out of a rocket, so take that and move it in close, which is going to start it quick and then end slow, just like that. I even want to change the end a little bit, so if I select those keyframes and then go into my graph editor, we'll start it out with a little bit more pace so that we have it boom, kind of doink, and then come back up, because we want to make sure that we are driving the energy of the ball. So if it shoots out quick, we want it to bounce back up quick, if that makes sense. So we kind of force that drive a little bit. In terms of the animation itself, there's one last thing that I want to add, and that is an expression called inertial bounce. It's a nice little simple expression that just adds a little bit of bounce, and I'm thinking to mainly add it to our little animation at the end where it kind of splits apart to get a little bit of extra motion in there. So I'm going to select those layers, the two controllers and the E, and hit U, and then I'm going to alt click on the stopwatch and copy or paste my expression in there in all of them. If we play that back, you can see there isn't much going on because of the way we've eased these keyframes. If I were to take these keyframes and add no easing at all, you can see there's a lot more bounce. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that the easing does play a huge role in the impact because it calculates it based off of that. So if I go into my preset and I add a bit of sexy speed and play that back, we should be able to get just a little bit of that extra follow through motion, which just makes it look pretty darn nice. And we can add this to any layers that we want, maybe even the D, the rotation, the tiniest bit of motion going through, which just helps sell it a little bit more. We are gonna take all of these layers and we're gonna pre-comp them by holding Shift, Command, and then C, and we're just gonna name this text pre, so that we have one layer to work with, so we don't have to think so much about it. And we can add echo to that pre-comp, which is just gonna make it super sick. This is a technique you'll see in a whole bunch of local animations, myself included. I've used it a whole bunch. Change it to composite and back, and then set the echo time to something like -0.003. Increase the number of echoes to something that looks pretty sweet. I usually go for about 40 as a base. I found that looks pretty good. And then if we play that back, we get some really nice old school echo trails, kind of like an actual hand-drawn animation. And then we're gonna add an adjustment layer and add a posterized time to it, and set that to something like 12, which again stems from classic animation where it would just be too many frames to draw by hand, 24 of each thing. So you'd often do it in half speed, so 12 frames, and then just do 2 frames every time, so you get that full 24 frames per second. Now we want to create a little bit of a background. I'm just going to hit Command Y to create a new solid and just name this background. And let's go with like maybe a greenish yellowish theme. So we'll trying to go with something that's pretty colorful, get a nice colored background in there, and let's get some nice gradients in there. Maybe duplicate the background and just name this color 1, and then Shift Command Y to bring up the solid settings and change it to something maybe a yellowish tone of color, maybe a little bit darker than that, closer to orange. Get that in there, and then draw a mask. Let's just get a nice mask like this in here, and we will duplicate that and change the, hit M to bring up the mask path, just click that and hit V, and then just draw it somewhere else, maybe over here, and Shift Command Y again to bring up the solid settings for that one, and change it to maybe a more bluish, maybe like a darker green color, maybe something that would go nice and well, maybe like a slight turquoise. And then hit M, open up the mask properties, keyframe the mask path, go forward a little bit, and you can click that and then move it maybe over this way, and we will do the same with the other one. And then above all of this, I'm gonna add another adjustment layer, so Shift Command Y, Alt Command Y, sorry, and add a Softbox below and increase that so we get some nice colors in there, and maybe even add another layer in here, which is gonna be like a highlight color. Shift Command Y to bring up that, and pick a nice light color, and hit M to bring up the mask, and just delete that. And then we'll just create a nice little one that's kind of floating around somewhere. And we can change the blend mode of that to something like overlay maybe. Overlay works a little bit better. Keyframe the mask path again, and move it around a little bit. And we will add a turbulent displace to this layer also, and increase the size a little bit, maybe like 150. And then we can play around with the amount until we get something that looks pretty cool without it breaking. And then we can always alt click the evolution and just do time times something like 10, and that'll just mean it'll just animate a little bit as we go along, creating some pretty wicked colors in there. And maybe even add another Softbox below to it just to smooth it out a little bit more. That'll be pretty much it for that. So we can close that up, and we'll just take all of these layers and pre-comp them and name this back gradient. Scale up my background a little bit just to make it a little bit less crazy. Add a solid and set the hex code to 808080, which will be a middle gray. Add grain to it and set the preset to something like let's do a 200T and final output, and we will increase the size of it a little bit to something like 1.5, and then we will add a tint, pre-comp that, name it grain pre, and make sure you move all attributes into the new composition. Change the blending mode to something like overlay, which will just give us a little bit of grain in there. Looks super sick. And just like that, we've made a super simple and cool little text animation in After Effects using some pretty basic techniques, but just taking it to the next level by adding some super cool custom easing and playing around with the pacing of it and just making it just look super sick. It's definitely something cool to try out, and I would highly recommend you trying it out and playing around with the easing, because it's such a powerful tool if you can learn to master it. But with that being said, hopefully you're inspired to go and play with this on your own. I'll see you again next week. Until then, peace out.